Mansplaining feminism. The idea is that I explain feminism to my good friend Billy, who says he knows nothing. We will go through feminist texts from the 19th century until yesterday. I have studied feminism myself, and that makes me more than qualified to explain everything about it to everyone. Perhaps it is a little arrogant to assume this, but then again, it wouldn't be mansplaining if it wasn't. Today's episode, The Second Sex, Volume 2, Liberation of Women through Transcendence. Hi Billy, welcome back.
Hello, it's great to be back.
Week 3, Episode 3. We're going to look at Volume 2 of Simone de Beauvoir.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's the same book, Second Sex, but it's the second part of it, basically.
Okay, remind me what happened in the last episode.
You remind me what you remember.
I remember we were talking about this guy, Michael Jordan, who went to the University of North Carolina.
No, that's different. That was a different podcast.
Sorry.
Okay, so Simone de Beauvoir, do you remember she gave us 3 examples of how women sometimes are tried to be defined by society. So biology, psychoanalysis, and sort of historical materialism.
Sperm and the egg.
So she shows that these 3 have massive male biases, and that actually none of them encapsulate what being a woman actually means. Basically, that was it. That was Volume 1. In Volume 2, it opens with a very famous sentence. Are you ready for this famous sentence?
Very ready.
The sentence is, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." So that's basically her sort of departure from Freud. Because Freud sort of argues that one is born a woman and one is born a man, and she argues that being a woman, the thing that encapsulates what woman, what it means to be a woman, is not something you're born with, but something you become through the different stages of from being born to growing up as a young child, to being a teenager, to an adult, to getting married, and then to becoming old.
So she doesn't believe in gender, or
she does, but she thinks it's something you become, and so social pressures and social norms and culture, so on and so forth. That's what creates gender norms. So this is the sort of times where all this discussion starts about what you know from Twitter. You said about there is no such thing as gender. Gender is constructed. All the stuff. All the juicy
stuff. That's very relevant to what I read in the newspaper these days.
Yeah, that's all that stuff. It sort of starts with Simone de Beauvoir.
So give us a bit more detail then. What's her actual views on gender and becoming a woman?
So, I mean, if you remember the first episode, that's called the first wave feminism, right? So all these, like we said, people asking for rights such as voting, inheritance, this sort of very, sort of public rights that law gives people. I mean, though that first wave of feminism, they said that we demand these rights, and why we're not giving them, it makes no sense. Some people argue that Simone de Beauvoir starts the second wave of feminism, which is the wave which says, yes, all those things are important, but the real oppression of women is in the very way we are created, in the very understanding of what it means to be a woman. And she says that actually being a woman in the way it means in society is something that's created. So actually it's a very liberatory sort of belief, because she says women can change their fate. The way the pressures you have are not because of your biology. It's something that you become and something that society makes you, which means if we change society, we can change what it means to be a woman, and we can free womanhood.
Okay, so as far as I understand, wave 1, first wave is quite material in the sense that it's related to human rights. Exactly. And the physical things, the physical experiences that women go through on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And the second one is also material, but also ideological and discursive.
Very
in the
much
sense
so.
That is that right?
That's extremely right.
Come on, yes.
That's more than right, because that's actually perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've taken 2 right turns.
Two right
And
turns.
now I'm going backwards.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, it goes through the different stages of being a woman. And a lot of it is about sexuality, a lot of this second volume. She says that, I think I mentioned in the first, about when we talked about the first volume, that boys go through a tougher time when they're young, right? Because me and you are boys here. So I say we, are told to be strong, independent. I don't know if this happened to you. Did you ever have a bully at school?
Not really.
Not really. But you know the sort of cliche of having a bully and then you go home and cry and your dad says, stand up for yourself. Stop crying.
Okay.
Stop crying.
I've seen Hollywood films.
Yeah, you've seen Simpsons.
I know how this story goes.
Yeah. So that story is what she says. So it's tougher for boys to grow up, in a sense, she says, because girls are sort of protected and doted on and so on and so forth, whilst boys are, refused kisses and hugs. And they said, become independent, whilst girls are kissed and hugged by parents and taken care of. But here's where volume 2 gets very different, because she says biology is very important to the nature of being a man and a woman. Boys, because they have this outwardly pointing thing that is their genitalia, it's already outside themselves. So literally from the discovery of the penis by boys, it's this sort of outwardly projection of the self. So boys basically discover their sexuality while discovering themselves as something that goes out to discover the world. Does that make sense? Whilst for women, it's like an internal thing that is hidden, no one really talks about. For girls, sorry. Does that make sense?
In theory, yes.
Yeah. So in theory, this is where she talks about 2 very important terms for her. It's called transcendence and immanence. And Simone de Beauvoir basically is about these 2 terms. So transcendence for her is real freedom. It's when people can overcome or sort of move out of the human condition. Like dream about awesome things, invent stuff, write, genius things. Genius is all about transcendence, of coming out of our current position, whilst immanence is all about protecting the species, the sort of passive side of humanity, right? So those
give me 2 examples. One example of transcendence, one example of immanence.
Transcendence would be an awesome poet. Who's your favorite poet or musician or artist?
Tupac Shakur, rest in peace.
So Tupac Shakur transcended his social context, right? He grew up in a racist society, although I think he was relatively educated family, but he still transcended that and became a universal thing that a lot of people like me and you here in the UK could connect to, because he transcended his social context.
Okay.
Right? He was outwardly sort of projected. Whilst immanence, an example of that would be someone, so Simone de Beauvoir gives the example of like housewives, for example, or women or mothers, because they have to sort of stay and protect the family and sort of maintain life, but not sort of project themselves outwards. Does that make sense?
The second one, not so much. So an immanence is someone who is enforcing the status quo.
Exactly. That's much better. Passive, status quo, internally focused rather than outwardly focused.
Okay.
And so
immanent is women and transcendent is man. Is that right?
Yeah, but she says both of them are for men. So men, so us, for example, we go through 2 different things. Like, let's say this podcast was my idea of, transcendence, of doing something outwardly to send out to the world in order to make loads of people listen to it so we can make loads of money.
And I'm sure all those 3 people will be extremely inspired by this.
And immanence is the feeling or the sort of project that we're both involved in as well, because we also want to make sure our homes are safe and, make sure we stay alive and eat well and that kind of thing. So those two things exist within us. What she says is that for women, transcendence is very difficult because they are constantly through their life sort of pushed into only having that immanence, not transcendence. So the risk-taking, the active sort of part of us is crushed out of women.
Right.
And this she calls absolute evil.
Okay, and who crushes it out of women?
Society. I think she blames society. She doesn't blame men, she blames society. Because she says basically when a girl grows up, the myths that she hears are, Prince Charming coming and saving her. She's an object to be saved and protected, like we said before. So even though she fights against this, and teenagers obviously rebel against what society demands of them, it's still this sort of struggle she's in. Whilst for guys, when it comes to their desire being women, they sort of desire women, but as sort of as objects outside themselves. And boys desire girls, but they also desire all sorts of other things like trucks. I can't think of another example. I don't know, like things, other things, cool jobs.
Boys do love trucks.
And dinosaurs.
Okay, so this is the main idea of Volume 2, Transcendence and Immanence.
Very much so.
But what does she say then? Does she just point out the problem, or does she give some kind of...
She sort of points at solutions at the end, but it's more about pointing out... She basically goes through different, mostly anecdotal evidence of this dichotomy being true. So she says... in one bit, she says it's not just society, it's also physical, because puberty makes the girl weaker because her breasts become a burden. Each month, women go through, this feeling of being semi-alienated from everyone else. There's hormonal imbalance. These are all her words, by the way. She said...
Her words through your mouth.
Through my mouth. So yeah, you can blame me. There's this, she calls it organic disorder. Whilst boys... when they discover themselves, they're all about violence and oppression and freedom.
They're all about trucks,
They're all about trucks. Driving trucks into other trucks.
What do women love?
Women love dolls. Women love nurturing and taking care of other girls because that's how they see themselves as nurturers, because they are themselves the object of nurture and protection, according to Simone de Beauvoir.
Right. So Simone de Beauvoir is saying that they should nurture trucks instead.
Yeah. At the very end, actually, she says that we don't have to remove gender sort of roles, but it's allowing women that transcendence, allowing women to become subjects and falling in love with men as subjects, as equals, rather than men seeing them as conquests, and sort of there's that violent aspect to that, and girls and women being this passive receiver of men. If this power relationship changes, then we can love each other as equals. Actually, she didn't really... You asked last week if she's a feminist, or what feminism meant to her. I think something along those lines. But I read that she actually didn't define herself as feminist until much later, because she was first and foremost a socialist. So she thought that if society becomes more equal, women's rights would be a lot less important, sort of in isolation. But in the 70s, once she sort of saw the communist countries not having very equal societies, gender-wise, she then sort of added her name to the feminist movement.
That's quite interesting, because in the first episode, you spoke about the struggle being actually a civil rights struggle, or an ethical struggle structured through the framework of religious values. And this time, you're saying that it's a socialist struggle.
Yeah,
it doesn't seem like they're not self-identifying as a female struggle per se.
No, and it's very much so with Simone de Beauvoir. It becomes so. Next week we will talk about Betty Friedan, and she was not only the author of a very famous book called The Feminine Mystique, but she literally became the president or the leader of the feminist movement, the second wave movement. And that sort of movement did call for specifically women's rights. But Simone de Beauvoir is, in the sort of socialist aspect of it, where society, her main thing is our control of how society is structured is the reason why we can't fight it. It's the reason why women will be forever oppressed unless we get access to it in the full democracy, which can only be possible in a socialist/communist world.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was the reaction to the second volume?
They loved it. So the second volume and the first volume were published together, but the second volume is the real in sort of influential aspect of it, this transcendence and immanence aspect of it, right? And it did give birth to a huge wave of which became the second wave feminist. It's just that she herself, Simone de Beauvoir, didn't really attach herself to that movement politically and actively, but it was a big movement, especially in America. This was in France, right? So once the book was translated into English in the 50s, it became very, very influential, even though she herself didn't attach herself to it. She does actually talk about some material things like reproductive rights and abortion, which is now a big thing amongst sort of feminists and women's rights activists. She talks about it a lot in this one, reproductive rights, abortion, domestic violence. But the main thing for Simone de Beauvoir in the second volume is marriage. Marriage is the problematic social relationship which crushes women and sort of defines them. Because if you're married as a woman, you're defined by marriage. If you're not married, if you're a single woman, you're defined by marriage. So marriage is the sort of totem against which everything else is related.
So she's asking the question about what it means to be a woman.
Yeah, that's volume
right?
1. Yeah.
This is the volume 1.
Yeah.
And volume 2 is Transcendence and Immanence.
Exactly. She sort of answers the question saying, well, to be a woman means to be trapped in immanence. That's what makes woman.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to change what being woman means. Even though there are these physical differences that she goes through, she says we need to change what being woman means so that we can also have access to transcendence, because true human freedom comes from freedom to transcend your sort of natural context, like Tupac Shakur. She even says this is the reason. So one of the anecdotal proofs she gives of this is that, as you can see in the world, women do not reach men's level of creativity and genius. Which might sound controversial, but that's what she says. So she says that this is why, you just look around you, you don't see women, being this genius creative. Very, very rarely do they sort of create this, transcend themselves and create awesome art and genius philosophy. And the reason for that is they're stuck in this immanence. It's not just societal bans on women writing or working. It's the very way we define women. And the only way we can come out of that is if we define what being woman is as a subject.
Okay. So now we've hit the second wave.
Now
we're going to ride that wave. Where are we going?
We're going to the Betty Friedan first, and then we're going...
Sorry?
Betty Friedan.
Betty Friedan.
Yeah, she wrote The Feminine Mystique that I told you about. And she becomes the leader of the second wave. After her, basically, are a ton of other people. So there's a lot of what we're going through is the 70s. So we're going to look at Betty Friedan, Valerie Solanas, Marianne Weathers, Dialectic of Sex, I think, comes later. So all of this is in the 60s and 70s. And I think the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 episodes are about the 70s. So quite a lot in the 70s, which is a very, very heavy second wave focused chunk of feminist history, where women write about what it means to be a woman and how to define the movement, and then after that how to beat the system, how to make it more equal.
I'm very excited to go on that journey with you.
Me too.
In a giant flaming truck.
in a giant flaming truck full of dinosaurs with a blaring soundtrack of Tupac Shakur.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace, bro.